This is a video lecture of the digestive system, looking at the major functions of the digestive system. We know that absorption of nutrients is essential to survival. We need to take nutrients from the different foods that we eat, which would be carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, and nucleic acids, and break that down into their smaller molecular components. So here we can see these complex food molecules here as a result of digestion with the help of enzymes and different digestive secretions. We see glucose here, and this is an example of an amino acid, and here we see a fatty acid, and here is a protein. So we can take these complex food molecules and break them down into simple molecules that can be absorbed across the intestinal wall and into the blood, and then used to make new substances, new proteins, new fats, new carbohydrates. For example, we can take glucose and use it to store glucose as glycogen. We can put together different amino acids to make different proteins. For example, hemoglobin is a protein, insulin is a protein. So we take these small molecules and put them together in a new way. Example of fats would be like we take cholesterol, or we take the different components of fat from our diet and we use that to make cholesterol in the liver. So we can take these smaller molecules and reassemble them into molecules that are used by the body. So looking at the anatomy of the digestive tract, we talked about this in lab already. The digestive system, as far as organs that actually receive and transmit food, begins in the mouth, moving down to the esophagus, into the stomach, into the small intestine, which begins with the duodenum, then the jejunum, and then the ileum at the end of the small intestine, into the large intestine, and out the body via the rectum and the anal canal. So that's the digestive tract, otherwise called the alimentary canal. And these are the structures that actually receive and transmit food. So this list here is something you should know in order as food passes through them. Along the way, we have different glands that add their secretions to the digestive tract, but food doesn't necessarily pass through them. And 2 or 3 organs that we can look at are the liver. The liver is a digestive organ that food does not pass through, but it does secrete contents into the digestive tract, into the duodenum. The pancreas here is shown behind the stomach. That also secretes some digestive contents into the duodenum. And the gallbladder secretes its contents into the duodenum. So they help with digestion. Therefore, we call them accessory organs. So starting with some general processes of the digestive tract. When we ingest food, that means we're bringing food from the oral cavity down the esophagus into the stomach. So the process of the digestion requires smooth muscle contraction to move that food from the mouth to the stomach. We'll talk about that process in just a minute. Mastication is a process where we break food down, making it soft and able to be swallowed. So the teeth are responsible for mastication. So that's another word for chewing. And then propulsion. How that food moves through the digestive tract occurs in a couple of different ways. The first one is swallowing. Swallowing is when we take our tongue and push the food to the back of the pharynx, and then smooth muscle contractions will take it toward the esophagus. Peristalsis refers to those wave-like movements that move food through the digestive tract. So it's waves of smooth muscle contraction from behind the food, pushing it down, and it gets further and further down the tract through these smooth muscle contractions. Another type of smooth muscle contraction is called segmentation, and this is where we have movement in front of and behind the food, moving it back and forth. And that allows for greater mixing of food and slower movement of food through the tract. So we see this in the small intestine, where we're continuing to digest that food and also allow time for the nutrients to leave that food and enter the blood around the digestive tract. So when we look at the small intestine after food has left the stomach, we see this segmentation going. Here we can see the food is being broken down more and more into a liquid, and those nutrients are distributed across the tracts to, again, allow good absorption from the digestive tract into the blood. So mixing is a result of that segmental contraction. Secretion is when we have substances leaving the wall of the digestive tract and entering the lumen to help lubricate the food. In the case of mucus, is a good lubricant. Liquefying it and digesting it occurs through the help of hydrochloric acid and different digestive enzymes that are secreted along the way. And this digestion, where we're breaking substances down into smaller and smaller molecules, can be mechanical or chemical. Mechanical digestion is when we're physically acting on the food and propelling it back and forth, breaking it down into a liquid substance. For example, chewing would be an example of mechanical digestion. The different wave-like contractions in the stomach that mixes the food back and forth, that would be mechanical digestion. Where chemical digestion refers to digestive enzymes acting on the food. So those are chemicals breaking the bonds of those complex molecules and breaking them down into smaller units. So for example, proteins are broken down to amino acids. Complex carbohydrates like starch are broken down into glucose. Fatty compounds are broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. So those are examples of different types of chemical digestion. Absorption is when we take those molecules that have been digested and we absorb them into the cells that line the wall of the digestive tract and then into the blood or lymph. So we're taking those important molecules out of the digestive tract and sending them into the blood to be circulated throughout the body and be used by the different cells of the tissues. Elimination is whatever's left in the digestive tract that is not needed for metabolism and survival remains in the digestive tract and leaves through the anal canal. So to regulate this process of digestion occurring throughout the tract, we have the nervous system acting on the tract, and we also have local reflexes that occur within the digestive tract itself. For example, when the stomach wall is stretched, it causes the release of digestive hormones to begin digestion. And that is something we'll talk about a little bit more when we get into looking at the stomach specifically. But again, we're acting on smooth muscle and glands within the tract to either promote or inhibit digestion. So again, we said that a digestion begins in the oral cavity when we chew the food, and also we have saliva that acts on the food and has different components that prevent infection in the mouth. So there's different antibiotics within saliva. It helps to lubricate the food. There's some mucus and water in saliva that helps to lubricate food. And then there's some enzymes, and there's one enzyme, the primary enzyme, and that is salivary amylase. And amylase breaks down starches. So if you have a cracker, for example, or bread, anything that's made up of starch, that starts to break down in the mouth. So you can give a baby a saltine cracker because of that salivary amylase. But you can't give that same baby without any teeth a tortilla chip because those compounds or molecules are much more complex, and amylase cannot break down those more complex molecules like cellulose, which is roughage, that does not break down with enzymes and remains in the tract. So that is more of a choking hazard. But amylase acts on simple carbohydrates like starches. So when a patient is not eating, they have poor saliva production, and as a result of that, they're going to be more at risk for infection within the mouth, and they're going to have a very dry mouth. So it's important that we do oral care on our patients that are not receiving any food that are going to have low saliva production, or patients that are on have a nasogastric tube, or patients that are have a tracheostomy and are on a ventilator. We definitely want to make sure we're providing oral care and lubricating their lips and the inside of their mouth to prevent infection and discomfort during that time. So the pharynx receives the food from the oral cavity then, so that's what we know as the throat, and there's 3 different regions of the pharynx that we talked about in lab. The nasopharynx is behind the nasal cavity, and then the oral pharynx is this region behind the oral cavity from the uvula to the tip of the epiglottis is the oral pharynx. And then the laryngopharynx is behind the larynx, transmits food toward the esophagus. So we don't want this food going into the airways, into the trachea. So the epiglottis covers the trachea when we swallow to prevent that food from going into the airways. So food is transmitted from the oral cavity to the oral pharynx, laryngopharynx, and then to the esophagus. And there's a sphincter at the top of the esophagus to control that movement of food. So once that food passes through the esophageal sphincter, it's less likely to move its way back upward toward the pharynx. Smooth muscle contractions are going to take over and move that down the esophagus to the lower esophageal sphincter. And the lower esophageal sphincter we talked about in lab, it's also called the cardiac sphincter, and that's what controls movement of that food into the stomach. When patients have acid reflux, what happens is some of that food works its way back up through the cardiac sphincter and causes a burning sensation in the chest. And this lies right behind the heart. That's why it's called the cardiac sphincter. And sometimes the symptoms of acid reflux can be the same as those of a heart attack. So it's important that we see those patients that are experiencing chest pain, but we have to rule out any kind of digestive issues, because when we treat acid reflux, that's a lot easier to treat than someone who's coming in with chest pain related to poor oxygenation of the heart muscle. So that leads to the stomach. When we get to the stomach, we can see that there's different regions of the stomach, and there's the wrinkles on the inside of the stomach called the rugae, which allow the stomach to stretch and then go back to a resting length when there's no longer food or liquid in the stomach. So we can see there's several different layers of muscle that line the stomach, and these, when they contract, act in a twisting motion to allow that food to be pushed toward the pyloric sphincter, and the liquid food remains close to the bottom of the stomach, and any solid particles are pushed back up to the top, to the fundus. So this mixing occurs where we take this food that's a soft bolus when it enters from the esophagus, and it is combined or mixed back and forth and turned into a liquid that we call chyme. And you should know that term, chyme, C-H-Y-M-E. That's liquid food, essentially, that is ready to enter the small intestine and be further digested. And the only real digestion we see occurring in the stomach is a little bit of protein because of this enzyme. The cells that line the stomach here, we can see there's numerous kinds of cells that line the stomach wall, and they are formed into these little pits that line the stomach. So these pits act on the food, and primarily at the surface of the pit we can see our mucus cells. So mucus is a very important secretion of the stomach. And then we also have these parietal cells that secrete hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. Hydrochloric acid helps to digest that food, break it down further, and prepare it for the small intestine, bringing down the pH. And the intrinsic factor helps to absorb B vitamins. So we need intrinsic factor to absorb vitamin B12, which is important in making red blood cells. So some people are not able to produce intrinsic factor. As a result, they can't absorb vitamin B12 from their diet, and as a result of that, they are not able to keep up with red blood cell production, and they become anemic. So that is a very important factor released by cells in the stomach for vitamin B12 absorption. Another cell here at the bottom of the pit are the chief cells, and those contain the enzyme pepsinogen for breaking down proteins. So protein digestion begins in the stomach. Protein digestion with the help of pepsinogen. So definitely know the function of pepsinogen, which is to break down protein, and it's released by the stomach. And then at the bottom we have a few endocrine cells, which means these secretions are released to the blood, and the primary endocrine hormone released by the stomach is gastrin. And the prefix gastra refers to the stomach, so you'll see the term gastric in reference to different things within the stomach. So a gastric ulcer here is where a hole has been burned in the stomach wall because of increased acidic conditions because of the hydrochloric acid and poor digestion, causing that hydrochloric acid to become too concentrated, and then it burns a hole in the stomach, which we call an ulcer. So when we look at the phases of secretion that control digestive activity in the stomach, Some of it that can be stimulated, there's stimulatory events and inhibitory events. Some of that gastric secretion is stimulated just thinking or seeing food. Of course, I'm sure all of us have felt our mouth water when we saw something on television or somebody was talking about a particular food that they had eaten or prepared. It just makes you think of it. We call that the cephalic phase of gastric secretion, and that begins in the cortex because we're thinking about it. That's the thinking part of our brain, and that gets those secretions started in the stomach. And again, that smell or taste of foods, when we first bring it into our senses, if it's in the environment, that too will stimulate digestion to begin in the stomach. Once we bring food into the stomach and the stretching of the stomach walls, that also will stimulate secretions within the stomach to begin digestion. And specific chemicals that we put into the stomach is going to stimulate digestive secretions. So peptides, again, those are when we bring protein in the stomach, or caffeine via coffee, that's going to stimulate digestion. And maybe you've heard that people who are dieting should avoid caffeinated beverages, and that's true, because when you drink a caffeinated beverages, that's going to stimulate digestive activity and give you the feelings of hunger if there's no food for that digestive activity to act upon. It also is going to increase acidity within the stomach because it causes increased HCl production, which will lower the pH. And if there's no food in the stomach other than just coffee, that is hard on the stomach wall. And then when that food enters into the duodenum and digestion is continuing, that also will stimulate more digestion within the stomach to get the stomach and the small intestine working together. Now, different things that would inhibit digestion in the stomach would be things that are happening emotionally at the level of the cerebral cortex. Stress, so loss of appetite due to stress or depression, that's going to slow digestion. As a result, people get an upset stomach, ulcers, constipation when they have these inhibitory events such as depression or stress. Excessive acidity in the stomach, pH less than 2, so when digestion begins and the pH gets lower and lower as HCl is produced, that's going to inhibit further digestion because we don't want to continue to bring that pH down until the digestion is complete. So again, that's going to inhibit digestive activity once that pH hits a less than 2. And we talked about emotional stress. Sympathetic nervous system activation is going to slow down smooth muscle contraction. Because remember, we talked about the parasympathetic is the rest and digest division of the autonomic nervous system. So when we're relaxed, that stimulates the vagus nerve. So when we're just kind of chilling out, we're going to see good digestion after a meal. But if we're stressed, the sympathetic neurons feeding the stomach will override that vagus nerve's input and slow digestion, causing nausea. So same thing, when we have food in the duodenum and it's stretched and we have a lot of digestion already occurring, that's going to act on, if we have specific contents within there. So if we have fatty, acidic food in the small intestine, that's going to slow digestion. And that's why people, when they eat something fatty, say if you go to McDonald's for lunch, you don't feel hungry as soon as you would if you ate something like pasta for lunch, which can be digested more easily. So when we have fatty substances in the duodenum, that slows digestion, and you're going to feel less hunger as a result of that. So when you look at these smooth muscle contractions within the stomach, we see it starts at the cardiac fundus and continues to move downward toward the duodenum, toward the pylorus region. And again, any solid food is going to work its way back up to the fundus, while that liquid contents at the pylorus will enter into the duodenum through the pyloric sphincter. So we see this motion back and forth, the mixing of the food, which is a result of peristalsis, converting that food from a bolus that was swallowed, a soft mass of food, to chyme, which is liquid. So the purpose of the stomach is not only to digest a little bit of protein, but also to convert that food into a liquid, which we call chyme. Once that food enters the small intestine, that is the region of digestion and absorption. So when we really break down those molecules into their smallest components that can be absorbed into the blood, this is occurring in the small intestine. And a lot of that digestion occurs right here in the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. And it's about, 10 inches long, where the jejunum, this middle portion where a lot of absorption occurs as well, is about 8 feet long. So very long tract here for absorption to occur and to maximize the nutrients we're getting from that digestive tract. So if we look at the wall of the small intestine, we're going to see these finger-like extensions called villi that are lined with tiny cells, simple columnar epithelium, and the plasma membrane of a simple columnar cell also has tiny finger-like extensions where the plasma membrane moves upward a little bit, all to increase surface area. So these villi, as well as the microvilli on the individual cells of the villi, all increase surface area for absorption. And these microvilli we call the brush border because these cells secrete enzymes to further help digestion. So we have what we call brush border enzymes that line the simple columnar cells to help further the digestive process. Also, we see in the middle of this villus, we see a special part of the lymphatic system. This is called a lacteal, and the lacteals play a role in absorbing fat from the digestive tract. So without functional lacteals, we could not absorb fat and break down the fat in the food that we eat. So these are important parts of the lymphatic system, but their digestive role is to break down fat. We also see the capillaries here within the villus. So once that food is absorbed from the digestive tract into the cells of the small intestine, it then will enter the blood and be carried off and into the general circulation.